So tomorrow, South African schools open their doors as parents contend with anxiety over placements, high school fees and safety of their loved ones. Violence in schools made headlines last year, with some gruesome acts playing out around the country. That's both at lower and higher education. Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga revealed that there were 1,345 violent hotspots in the country, and that is at basic education level. We'll also take a look at what happens at tertiary institutions. We're joined now by Mugwena Mokoena, who is South African Democratic Teachers Union's General Secretary. He is in our Pretoria studios. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, and thank you for having me, Tapiso, and good evening to the viewers.
And I know it's quite a lot of ground to cover, because we're looking at both basic education level but at tertiary institution, because we've seen some very horrifying headlines at both levels of schooling. How concerned are you not only about the state of bullying but violence in our institutions of learning?
Well, we are concerned because we always make an appeal to parents to register their children as early as possible when the higher education institution start advertising for the registration. But also the provinces always advise the parents to register on time, and therefore if those particular registration are not completed on time, our concern really is about the planning, that the principal and the school management are not able to do proper planning. They are not able to allocate the teachers in terms of their timetables. This has got an impact on the first day of schooling, as the parents would be descending to our schools for late registration. Indeed, this has got a negative impact on the few days to come, as the principal and the school will be trying to mop out the issues of registration, at the same time having to drive around looking for the circuit or to the district in order to request for more teachers and more resources in order to enable our learners to learn.
I mean, earlier on in the week, and let me just correct myself and say yesterday we spoke to a psychologist about what learners and pupils experience, especially when they arrive firstly at, say, institutions of higher learning. There's a depression that it sets on in terms of people perhaps come from poorer backgrounds. But you're speaking about lack of resources generally, and I'm wondering, how does this impact on crime and violence in schools?
Well, when you sit with a situation where there's this high level of inequality in terms of resources and also in terms of access, you are likely to see violence, because in any inequality situation, emotions tend to be very high, and those emotions tend to lead to aggressiveness, and that leads to violence in our schools. It leads to violence in our higher learning institutions, as we have seen as we close in 2019. The level of violence has been rising instead of being kept. This is as a result of a number of social problems as well as socio-economic problems. So the environment has got to be improved, both in terms of higher education, one in terms of security, but also in terms of ensuring that students do have accommodation, one in terms of academic registration as well as accommodation. And if those things are not addressed on time, they tend to create unnecessary tension and unnecessary disruptions, and sometimes these end up being so violent because, as I was saying, once other people feel that the others are favored and others are not being favored, it tends to blow up, and therefore it tends to be violent. So we need to avoid this type of a situation by planning properly every year, and we think we need to improve around this particular planning.
Mr. Mokoena, share with us your insights as such. What are your members saying? Some of the figures showing that Mpumalanga leads the way by crime and violence, followed by KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape. Why do you think that is? What are your members telling you about why certain provinces account for higher levels or numbers of bullying, of violence within the learning institutions?
Well, let's look at the higher education institution in terms of culture shock, that we are still seated with the legacy of the apartheid regime, where in areas where you have a number of languages, for example, in Mpumalanga, you have almost about 4 African languages, and there is always resistance or reluctance in terms of accepting one another. Then the level of violence or bullying is as a result of that. To then say, you don't speak my language, and therefore you are being despised, and therefore there will also be that particular reaction in around that. So when you look around issues of KZN and the other provinces where the level of violence is high, you also have to take into account issues of migrant parents who are away in Gauteng and have left their children alone at home, and therefore these as well tend to be an issue where children mock each other around the fact that your parent is not here, and they start bullying each other because you don't have these, I have these, and so forth. So these are social problems that the psychologists were correct that they need to be attended to, and therefore psychosocial services have got to be availed both in terms of your general education phase as well as higher education.
Has it been found that schools and communities with high crime and violence reflect that?
Yeah, well, socioeconomic problems would always be affected by violence, especially because these are areas where people have got access to a number of substances that are not good for our system. For example, the nyaupes, issues of other drugs, forms of drugs, and issues of alcohol, they have a way of really affecting our learning institution, both in terms of high schools as well as our higher education institution.
And then the question then must follow that, does the violence and the bullying begin outside of school, then spill over into school, or is it the other way around?
Well, it will be very difficult because I'm not a psychologist to then say where basically it begins, but we believe that what the children see in their communities, the schools will always be affected, because the schools and other learning institutions are microcosm of our society. So if we have a violent society and we have got parents who had teenage pregnancy at home and they ostracized them, and those particular young parents resented their own children, clearly it is that those particular children that have been resented, that have lacked attention, lacked love, they tend to be aggressive when they come to learning institution. And therefore one can say, yes, it begins at home, it begins in our society, and then it spills over to our schools.
All right, so I want to look at what the state is doing, what society is doing. Some of the criticism leveled against the state has been lack of political will. So I want to look at the policies in place. If we look at primary and high school level, for instance, the National School Safety Framework, is it enough to stem the violence that we're seeing in schools?
Well, yes, I must accept that it is not enough to have that policy alone. You also need some kind of a proactiveness from the department, where we are then able to identify issues that can really drive learners to be violent, to be bullying, and so forth. So we need to be very proactive. So one of the areas is identifying the National Development Plan, to then say we need to understand the 1,000 days of a child, how the child was conceived, and after that how the child has been looked after, and then we can begin to proactively say, yes, there is a possibility that this learner has lacked the following things, and therefore this is going to end up being a problem in our society.
Mr. Mugwena, I must ask this final question. If we have school safety committees in basic education, what about in tertiary education? What do we need to prevent students finding themselves in a position where they are vulnerable, where they're raped in premises where they're supposed to be safe?
Well, in higher education institutions, you also need the psychosocial services that is more proactive. They need to understand the students that come from poor background and those that are vulnerable. They need to also understand that, so then they are able to help those particular students. But they also, because we have got SRCs, they have got their own committees, and more collaboration is needed, more coordination between those particular structures that are in our higher education institution, where they're able to work together and so forth. So the other issue is the council itself. The council has got to establish some safety committees in our schools that can work with the police, work with the securities in our institution in order to curb this particular violence. We cannot have a single rape if we work together, because it's just unacceptable in a society where young girls or where young students who are females are not able to walk in their campuses because they are women. It cannot be accepted. So we can work together and be able to deal with it.
Thank you so much for your time and your insights, Mugwena. Mokoena is SATU, the South African Democratic Teachers Union's General Secretary.